great pleasure now to welcome the Union Finance Minister of India, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman on ET Now. Madam Minister, good evening. I know it's a very busy and a hectic week for you, yet you've managed to accommodate this interview request, so we are truly grateful for that.
You're welcome.
Madam Minister, I'm going to start today's interaction by quoting you, your first line of the budget. This is the first budget in the Amrit Kaal, and this budget truly defines that. It has given something to everyone. It's a budget where emphasis is there on growth, as well as it has prioritized development, and there is a promise towards fiscal development and fiscal consolidation. But Madam Minister, every budget has a different backdrop, a different priority and different compulsion. So what was the priority of this budget, the compulsion and the priority at play?
Well, I think we are at a stage where the growth momentum will have to be maintained. We can't at any cost appear to be not so focused on growth. Sustaining that growth and the momentum is so critical now than even 2 years ago. So if 2 years ago we were all focused to pull the economy out of the negative area we went in, now it's a time when we will have to be strong on sustaining that growth, because it is only that focused attention which has brought India to be the fastest growing economy this year and for the next, even though next year IMF predicts there will be a dip, but still. So it is that which is on the top priority. However, with that focus kept, we also wanted all states to have sufficient funds for each one of them to prioritize on their area of development, and the focus again on infrastructure there and so on. So it's not just our budget, but every budget of every state needs to have that cushion. So that has been the top of our priority.
So can I say that 2021 budget was about survival, given that we were hit by COVID? 2022 budget was about revival, but the spirit of this budget in a sense was really thrive, so that India can take a giant leap forward.
Sustain to thrive, if I may add that, because this year is going to be very critical. We need to have that, that taunt, really the tension which has to exist in the wire to remain, very fully flexed. If I am able to express myself well, you can't leave it loose, nor can you pull it too strong that it will break. So we need to keep it at absolutely that stretch which is right for it to be in the note. So it is that attempt which we have done this time. And in the process, we have just not forgotten about the critical areas which are so critical for India, to be inclusive and to cover areas and regions which have not really benefited by focused planning and so on. So we have kept all the three layers of elected governments, the center, state and the panchayats and so on. So that balance and that holding tight but not too tight, so that we can move fast, take off fast.
With each passing budget, Madam Minister, you've raised the bar. Indian budgets are now simple, predictable, and more importantly, impactful. Has Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman redefined the budget making process in India?
On just one point, I'd like to believe so. And that one point is to make budgets really what they are, speak what they are, to be read as what they are, and to be seen in numbers as what they are. Honest attempt, thanks to Prime Minister Modi's principle of be transparent, be accountable, to make the budget really speak truly what it is, rather than push something somewhere, cover up some others, keep everything outside that which is troublesome, not show it in budget. I didn't want to do that, and that has been from my day one. But of course, it does take a year or two before you really are able to pull that kind of influence in the budget. So I would think in the last 3 years we have aspired to show that, and I'm convinced we are showing that.
Madam Minister, we live in a very uncertain and tumultuous world. 2 years ago, COVID hit us. Last year, it was the war. You don't know what's coming next. So, in case there is an external shock this year, what are the buffers you are building in on the expenditure side as well as on the revenue side?
The buffers on the expenditure side is to be efficient in dispersal, efficient in multiplier giving, usage of money, and also to be sure that where necessary succor has to be provided to the economy, we will provide it, but we'll make sure we are transparent and efficient about it, not remain without asking the right questions. So efforts will have to be consciously taken for avoiding pilferage or unaccounted dispersals. Otherwise, I think plugging the loopholes in revenue generation and also making sure that avoidance is cut down. Like for instance, in this budget, you would have seen some steps that we've taken are not so much for taxing people, are not so much for earning money from them, but certainly if there is a clear sign, not subject to any subjectivity, clear sign of avoidance in the name of using the provisions and exemptions given, and if it is apparent that it is not for really the purpose for which it is meant, but it is a way of investing and earning, we have put our finger on that. So that is one way of making revenue being, or the collection being efficient, widening the tax base, be both in GST and in direct taxes, and also making sure that blatant staying out of the tax system should not be entertained. And how do you arrive at blatant staying out? There are very clear signs of the affordable levels at which you are, or well above the affordable, and therefore we want to. So these are conscious steps taken for India to generate right revenue, legally claimable revenue, and timely revenue.
Madam Minister, the high point for this year is the uptick in revenue collection, tax collection, both direct and indirect. Now your estimates for next year are conservative. Some would argue that to get a beat on a higher base would be very, very difficult.
We've tried being, I don't want to say underestimating our potential, but we want to be realistic, because the field formations also should not be tempted to resort to my God, this is a target given to me, will I be able to fill it? And therefore we assume the chances given for petty harassments, and several petty harassments can become a pain point, and we don't want that at all. One. And second, it's all right to give a budget with fantastic numbers, but end of the year it's again us who will have to answer it. So we've also brought in that element of be realistic, don't overstretch yourself. At the same time, that overstretching can also hurt others. So everywhere we've tried being realistic, and that's why when people ask me, have you reduced your budget on some things? No, we've been realistic. Absorption is also a very important indicator of where your money will be well received. There's no point in giving money in every head because it exists.
You spoke about the multiplier effect. Is that going to be the onus that you want to boost up the capital expenditure because the multiplier effect is the strongest, perhaps what you've seen in terms of the return back to the government?
Yes, undoubtedly. And in the last 2 years, when we went in that route, initially taking big risk, but later on we found that that is well established. We could prove that it is a system which works for India. And we were also convinced that it goes through the right route of eventually giving money in the hands of the people. And therefore, the last 2 years gave enough confidence that for the gaining of the right number of multiplier, and sustaining it for both the short and the medium term, this is the best route.
Madam Minister, the global supply chains are still broken down. Globally, inflation scare is not over. Since this budget is pro-growth, pro-development, there is a big allocation towards expenditure. What are the chances that it may end up stoking inflation in India?
May not be a comprehensive answer, but I think in India, capital expenditure leading to inflation is probably tenuous an argument than speculating on the external. External in the last few years, every speculation has been proven right. Whereas when you look at expenditure on capital assets, expenditure per se is not money flushing into the system. Expenditure in capital is actually going for purchase of goods.
Yes.
And those goods are core goods for the economy. They are not what you may call imitative expenditure. They're not flamboyant expenditure that somebody copies somebody else for the sake of living up to the Joneses, and therefore that adds to inflation. But that is the conspicuous consumption route. No, we are through the capital expenditure creating demand for core sector products, which in turn generates employment, which in turn gives money in the hands of people who have worked for that, and therefore they in turn bring in demand for your basic core living, which could be perishable goods, which could be basic food items, which could be essentials of FMCG, and so on. So the chances of capital expenditure spike leading to an inflation is a bit tenuous, because it brings in supply also together with demand.
But for the sustainability and for India's GDP to grow, center has done their own bit in doing heavy lifting in terms of capital expenditure. States perhaps have a lot to catch up.
I'm actually going to interrupt you to say, if center is also moving fast and in a very high scaled level, states have shown very good appetite for consumption, capital expenditure, and they are receiving the amounts given very well. But to be fair to them, that component of this capital 50-year loan that we give them, which comes with conditions, is where many of the states are finding it difficult to move ahead fulfilling those conditions, and therefore the 20% amount of that 1 lakh goes slowly, not as much as the other 80% goes. So that's where the difficulty is. It's not lack of appetite.
Prime Minister Modi's vision of financial inclusion now seems to be at play. For the first time, we are seeing savings are migrating out of traditional savings instrument into equities. Number of demat accounts. FIs were sellers last year, but domestic institutional investors were net buyers. Do you think the trend of this shift is a multi-year trend according to you?
I would think so, because people have tasted a certain success and they're able to see that the traction change has not resulted in hurting them, but it's actually helped them. They've not burnt their fingers. They're able to see, but every time I think many of them are conscious of the risk which is embedded in it. And I'm also happy to see that they're not just moving into equity, but also into debt, which is a very healthy sign, in that the investor is getting a lot more discerning. He's not just behaving like a small saving person who's averse to risk, whereas here you're able to see that they're able to take that element of risk and taste their success. It will sustain.
And financial inclusion is one of the sub-issues you mentioned in your budget as well.
Absolutely.
So, Madam Minister, the fact that there was no change in the capital gain structure this time, can we assume that this is some kind of an endorsement by the government that equity will get a preferential treatment, given that the equity culture in India is very nascent and the nature of equity is volatile, that it will get a preferential treatment?
Also consistency in policy. We don't want to keep changing too many things in too few short time. Capital gains tax, the last amendment was probably in 16 or 18?
2018.
18.
Yes.
And subsequent to that, ideally even 3 full years of not even gotten completed. So do you want to change the policy immediately? No, you would want to see how it works out. So in spite of the calls for this or that way of change, I think we more went in the way of providing stability in policy.
I'd like to draw your attention to a big success story, PSU banks. They had a lost decade, now they are back on track. The balance sheet is recapitalized. The NPAs are completely over. But operationally, do you think a lot needs to be done there? Because if I look at the ratios for PSU banks, they have a lot to catch up if you compare them with the private sector.
Absolutely, but there is a good lot of change there. They are lots more professional now. They're able to speak for themselves. They're not speaking as though, all right, even if I fail, there is somebody behind me who's going to keep unquestioningly giving me. That culture has changed. I can, even in my short period as a finance minister, I can tell you the way in which from the time you start your budget preparations, there would be early whispers or calls, and then also some heavy recommendations for recapitalizing banks. And it was as though if you didn't, they'll collapse. Gradually we moved from there, and now there's not just one call anywhere, not even one word anywhere saying, are you planning to recapitalize? No, banks have realized that they can stand on their feet. They can raise market monies from the market, and they realize it actually gives them a better spine with which they can stand up and speak. So there's no more, it's all right, there's somebody to support me. No, I can perform, I will perform, I'll show that I can perform. That sense is coming. You were right in saying one thing, that there's a bit more of management certainty, tenure certainty, and decision making to the extent of middle management. The top managements are all fine, they are totally seized of what they want. I think the middle management needs that kind of a confidence in decision making. So those are elements which we will have to infuse, and the banks will have to build consciously in themselves, so that they can become completely professional and behave at par or even better than the private banks.
But Madam Minister, if we have to become the third largest economy in this decade, we need capital and we need world-class infrastructure. Now we are a capital-starved country, which means we'll have to rely on foreign capital, and infrastructure really needs to take a giant leap forward. How will we achieve that?
This capital-starved country, I would like to have a bit of a rethink on that line. I would have said that in 2019. But the way in which domestic capital was available for people who are smart enough to use them, smart enough with good books to use them, and also their readiness to also get into the market, were all, the myths were disproved in 2020 and in subsequent 21 as well. So there is not a scarcity of capital. It is there, it's lying dormant. It has got to be knocked to be made awake. May not be sufficient, I grant that. May not be sufficient. But if this starts moving in the way in which it favors greater, moving into areas of productivity, foreign capital will not be waiting for too long. But I'm not saying foreign capital is waiting for this trigger to happen. That's anyway coming. But the delta will be a lot more if our fellows, within India are able to wake up and see what's before them.
On infrastructure, it's the government capital. Government is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Now we can argue that private sector is committing to capex cycle, but looking at the size of the opportunity, the entire determination of the government to really take things forward, predictability in taxes, do you think they should really catch up now?
I'm also purposely trying to look at it differently. Indian industry is not just represented by the old industry. There are just a lot of new ones who are coming up. New ones who are not just the small startups. New big ideas which are also getting grounded. And also new opportunities which are now there, and in the last few days I've had quite a few people talking to me. If there are the airline sector coming up with unbelievable numbers for demand, in the sense purchase of new aircrafts, it actually spurs the growth of the aircraft maintenance industries, training of personnel, that sector, and that itself is going to bring in certain things which probably were somewhere in the immediate neighborhood for India, Middle East or somewhere, but that's going to happen here. And thankfully, as a government, almost in anticipation, but did we anticipate is a different story, but almost in anticipation, policy facilitation happened for MROs, aircraft trainers, maintenance for other equipments which are required for MROs and so on. So if that's already happened, industry is that as well. Industry also is the sunrise area, where you're not even able to count what is getting added every 2 days in terms of the renewable energy capacities. We tend to look at the old industries and say, are they investing? Are they bringing in more? We don't seem to look at this one. This is going at a pace in which no country in the world is able to do it, match it. Similarly are the chips and so on. So the long and short of it is, where it is happening, we are not looking. Where we are used to, we are asking, saying, are you doing, are you doing? And they are, I'm not even blaming them. In fact, I want to understand them from the conversations that I've had. It's not just investing for additional capacity. They are now tempted to see how technology can make their capacity and also production on a different plank altogether. So their investment now is not just for just increasing the capacity or bringing a new plant, but also to bring in new technology and very differently produce from how they are doing it now. So these are going to be layered and complex decisions. It's not just putting that money that they've benefited from the reduction in corporate tax into something. It's also saying, is that something I need for producing the same product? I take the example of steel. It won't be a big deal for setting up another plant. But today the market, whether it is in Europe or anywhere else, the market is demanding from you green steel. So won't you have to think about bringing that technology which will give you production capabilities for green steel? It's just not an additional plant, it's a totally new plant of a new technology for the same product, but not really the same product, a calibratedly different product. So investment story of India is today a completely different story. We have all become so habituated to look at one set, we're not looking at other. That's happening and happening in a big way. This story, we are looking at it from the same old way of saying, are you bringing, but they're doing lots more of their work. So I think we also will have to change the ways in which we are studying the Indian economy. Indian economy is blooming in very many different areas. Of course, it has very many areas which need more attention. It's not as if I'm blind to this, but we have to see India in a newer context and concede that there are things happening which we are not even grappling with.
So true, Madam Minister. Madam Minister, Adani Group of companies, they've been the eye of the storm. Are you satisfied with the response the regulators have given?
I think the regulators in India are very well specialized in their areas. In the last few decades, the lessons learned by each one of them and the newer institutions which have come in the process through the legislative processes itself are very capable and match their peers elsewhere. I will not buy for a moment anyone saying Indian governance or that which you referred earlier, the governance or their regulatory mechanisms are not good enough. Not at all. In fact, in very many areas, we seem to be leading the way in terms of good governance. That's not to say that everything is all good about everybody, but I'm confident that the Indian regulators are well seized of what they have to do, and they will do the needful where and when necessary. I take the example of RBI, for instance. Most often people say, oh no, the regulation work will have to be done better. Look at what happened. In 2019, matter of fact, repeatedly I used to receive calls from, are you sure there won't be any more NBFC collapse? Are you sure there won't be any banks collapse? But even that one particular case, the RBI stood in time to set the matters right. So I think we all should see our regulators with due respects, without cynicism. They are world class. They will do their job.
But Madam Minister, the sell-off in Adani Group of stocks has led to extraordinary volatility in the market, and the regulator's job and the government's job is to curb the market volatility. Given that this kind of an extraordinary volatility could be repeated, is there case in revisiting the way how FIs invest and trade in India?
Well, I think the SEBI should be given a time to, come up clearly on understanding how this happened. What has actually happened? Okay, if I say this, people would say, oh, don't you know what's happened? Yes, we all know. But when I say what has happened, I'm saying it in a lot more deeper sense. I think it's now time for them to get a comprehensive picture, and I'm sure they would do it, and then maybe address issues that you're raising.
The government is very keen to push the new tax regime. Is there anecdotal data which the government has which indicates that if you take the exemptions out of the total tax system, it will stop revenue leakage? Because that is something which you referred to at the beginning of our interaction, that the government is consciously working towards plugging revenue leakage.
Yeah. The new tax regime was brought in more because we want a simplified tax regime. And a simplified tax regime with, let's say, a bit of a favorable tax slabs. Are you trying to close all the exemptions given? No. Those exemptions will last as long as people have availed of it, as long as there are people availing of it. But it's also in the interest of all of us to have the new regime, which has been, in the sense, simplified and with reasonable tax rates, has been a recommendation of very many committees. So the new regime will have to be made attractive enough for people to move there. And at this stage, we are more looking at people in the middle class who need that kind of a simplified, reasonable rate of tax regime. That's why we have to make that attractive. But it is not being made attractive at the cost of the old regime. That's available. Those who want to be there can very well be there.
So in future budgets, will there be more incentive given to the new tax regime?
We'll have to see as we go. But we expect a good number to move now into this.
Madam Minister, we are coming off a period where inflation was structurally low. Interest rates globally and locally were structurally low. Now inflation has inched higher and interest rates have inched higher. Given that India's savings are becoming lower, what is your view and what can be done to bring savings back? Because that has been the USP of India, a strong saving base.
Again, how are we looking at savings? Yes, India's culture, the family culture, and India's mindset of individuals is your first. I know there's some bank's motto also. Let your first expenditure be your saving. Some bank had it as a motto, if I can't recollect it. But it had that line, but in a more simpler thing. Let your first expenditure be your saving. They would have that mud pot wala
Kalash, yes.
gulak, is it?
Kalash, I think.
Kalash, no, gulak.
Gulak, yes, gulak.
Yes, gulak,
yeah.
into which
Piggy
a
bank.
coin will be shown
Piggy
as
bank.
being
Piggy
dropped.
bank, yes.
Piggy banks.
Yeah.
So like that, this country has had this culture of make sure you save something much before you spend something. But today the saving, like the way we've spoken, retail investment in markets, is very clearly not just a gulak but also looking at the market. So if the saving in the old-fashioned small savings is coming down, it's necessary for us to see where else it's going. So we need to encourage both. That's my feeling.
If I look at the shape of developed economies, their fiscal deficits are bloating. For India, fiscal deficit is coming down. Are you surprised, or I would actually say shocked, that India's ratings have not been changed?
Not shocked, but I think that is the way the world works, ironically and sadly. These are things which we are constantly discussing with, let's say, the rating agencies, let's say the investor community. But it is going to be some time for those institutions which have become the purveyors of countries and their financial health and the fiscal governance to be logical, to be data driven, and to be answerable. So it is going to be some time before the emerging markets can speak with confidence to those who are the purveyors, and they can be obstinate.
Just a fine print clarification, Madam Minister. The focus of this year's budget is digital, and in this budget, the ambit of angel tax has been extended to NRIs. How does this change in terms of valuation? Will it come under FEMA or will it come under IT Act?
No, I fully understand there is incongruity between the FEMA and the way in which we have implemented the taxation. One, first of all, it doesn't hurt the startups. They still enjoy the concessions given. We are trying to also bring parity between the domestic investor with the non-resident investor. But the difference between the FEMA and the income tax is more when income tax looks at ensuring equal or at par treatment, and FEMA looks at things which are beyond the finance ministry's narrow taxation limitations or viewpoints, because FEMA also looks at how money gets round tripped, and to curtail it, it has one measure which in principle we also agree, but that's the way it has played out. It is not to hurt anybody, and it doesn't certainly touch the startups with whom we've encouraged since 2016 little by little a regime which helps them. But there is definitely enough anecdotal evidence to say how it can be gamed.
Thanks to the efforts of the current administration, the Indian rupee trade has started with Russia. Now it has moved to some African countries, even Southeast Asian countries. Do you see this gaining traction? Because that changes. Of
course, there is a lot of interest. There are, of course, periodically reports in the media saying it's yet to play out and so on. But when you get into nitty-gritties, people do want to convince themselves. But in principle, all of them are agreed, and in some it has already taken effect, and some others they're getting into details to work it out. But I think the framework has been well received, and there is a lot of interest for people to, or countries to, get onto that board. Iran is one other you've missed out on, say.
Yes. So that process has started.
Yes.
Madam Minister, you've always said that budget is not the only forum on which reforms are done, and we've seen the administration has taken out series of reforms outside the budget. But in the run-up to the election cycle, 15 months away since the countdown has started, how will you maintain a balance between reform and populism?
I thought I'll be the last person to whom this question will be asked. I have not even yielded to the temptation, so you shouldn't ask me this question. In fact, I've shown my intent of not moving in that direction at all.
So, Madam Minister, the fear of freebies is unfortunately coming back, whether it is the old pension scheme or what is essentially happening to the state of Punjab, free electricity. That could change a lot of assumptions and calculations this year. Would you agree with that?
I'm yet to find that debate taking a fully informed set of facts on board and then move forward. So debates, particularly on money matters, cannot be on impressions. It cannot be on the impression of the current dispensation of the government. It cannot be on the impressions of current fiscal position. You have to be conscious that these are things where the next 2 generations of Indians can be affected. Just as where we are today, earlier generations had laid the foundation, we don't forget that. So a conscious call will have to be taken, but not just by one, but also by everybody, because it has an impact on India's fiscal. Keeping that fact in mind. You just can't be so buccaneer on these sort of things. So I would think quick decision making, speedy decision making cannot govern here. This has to be a considered decision with facts in your hand, not facts of today, but facts of what is going to happen to your future generation. So we have to be careful.
I'll not extend my appointment beyond 3 more last questions. This is the Amrit Kal. What is the meaning of Amrit Kal for a common man?
It's a time when I think a lot of foundation which has been laid will start giving rewards. It's also a time when it will not be too much for an Indian to dream of doing things in his country, of deriving values for himself from it, and also seeing tangible progress from where he is to where his children would be. So it's the churn, the proverbial, Samudra Manthan. Yes. The churn is actually now in a position to yield the Kalash. But it is still not in our hands yet. So I think these are that tiring phase where the churn is gone and we can't allow to let Vasuki down. You have to also be careful with the Vasuki and yet reach out to take the Kalash. So if I don't put it so metaphorically, it is because just imagine 20 years ago where we were.
Yes.
And where are we today?
And
similar will be the kind of observation which another set of people 20 years from now say, God, really, is this fast have we moved? And have we reached here? That's what is going to happen now, and that's what I would want every Indian to realize. It is this traction that we are gaining. Each one of us will have to be in it and not outside of it.
Madam Minister, you were the external minister, after that the defense minister, and now you're stint at the finance ministry. Which stint have you enjoyed the most?
Very difficult to say. Each one had its own charm and of course challenges.
Allow me to ask you one more question. I've been always curious to know that what is a day like in the life of India's Union's finance minister? What motivates her? What inspires her?
But I admire Indians. What have they not gone through between 2020 and now? We speak about freedom movement and the sacrifices made then. We've read about it. In my days as a child, there were some family members who were in their capacity involved. So we've heard it all. It was very motivating. But now I have one more set of stories of Indians who before me have struggled and come out with such great resilience. I just cannot but get motivated by seeing that, honestly. Amazing what they have gone through and how they've come out of it and how we appear to the world today. Just such a beautiful story. Of course, it had a lot of suffering. That motivates me.
Madam Minister, from where we were 3 years ago in terms of struggling with survival, then the economy revived, and now we have taken a sustainable leap forward. So thank you so very much, and once again, thank you very much for accommodating this interview request.
You're welcome, and thank you to all the viewers of your program.